In this module, I'm going to cover deadlines and escalations. There are two types of deadlines that we can track in BizFlow. The first is activity deadlines. So each individual task or activity in the process can have a deadline. In addition to that, the overall process can have a deadline. When you have a deadline on an individual work item or an individual activity, you'll see that in your work list. And you can see here that we have the due on date. So when this process was modeled and we created this particular activity, we set the deadline for 10/1. It got created on 9/30, and now we have this deadline on 10/1. And that's also what is making up our pie chart and showing us if items are overdue. When the deadline is set on the overall process, you're not going to see that in your work list, but where you are going to see that is on the process level, because the work list is your work. It's the assignments assigned to you. So it's not the deadline for the overall process, it's the deadline for that particular activity. Here what we see is the BizFlow monitor view and my active instances, and on those instances we see a due date. If I had set a deadline on this process, which I have not, but if I did, this is where I would see that process deadline. So this is the same item 309, and here we see the due on has a date and here we don't. And again, the distinction and the difference is that this is the work item and this is the overall process. When a deadline occurs, there are different types of alerts that you can use. One example is when a deadline occurs, you can trigger an email, and you can trigger one or more email notifications. And you'll see when you set up deadlines how you can specify different types of emails coming off of one deadline event. You can change the priority of the work in the work queue. I'll show you what that looks like. Here we see my work list, and in my work list I show a priority column. And the priority is set from 100 to 1, with 1 being the highest priority. So you can sort the column, that would be one way I could use priority, or I could list out a report and that would have various priorities. So we could see that priority can be controlled by a deadline. We can escalate work to someone else. Deadline occurs, it was due this afternoon and I didn't get to it, so it's going to move it to maybe someone that works on my team or my manager or to someone else. So we can literally move the work item from one person's work list to another. We could execute a custom application. Maybe there's some other action that you want BizFlow to take. You want it to send out a page, you want it to execute some other application logic somewhere else to perform some other type of function, and or all of the above. So you can actually set a single activity and deadline to have many or all of these types of alerts occur. To add a deadline to an activity, we use events, timer events. And so a timer event is one of the items on your palette, your BPMN palette, and you can drag and drop that over a human activity, and it's going to associate that timer event with that activity, and we call that a border event. Once you have that border event associated to that activity, then you can double click on that and you can set its attributes, and we'll do that in just a moment. The other way that we can use that border event or that timer event is when the timer goes off, we can create a line, a transition or sequence line to another activity. Now normally this would transition to activity 1. This activity would normally transition to activity 1 unless this deadline occurs, and if that deadline occurs, it's actually going to transition to a different step in the process. That's how we would escalate or move work from one person to another. Let's go take a look at how we set that in BizFlow, and then we can talk about email notifications. In the Process Studio, again, if I wanted to add a deadline to one of my activities, I would find my timer event, and I can drag and drop that over the activity. And you can see that I've done it here, so we'll drag and drop it over this activity. And now we've associated this timer with this particular activity in the process. And now on that activity on our deadline tab, this is where we can actually set our deadlines. I'll walk you through this screen. First, from what point in time, what are we using calendar-wise as a deadline? BISFO has the concept of working time deadline and a fixed deadline. A fixed deadline is simply a fixed deadline, and it is what it is from the time the work comes in based on the clock of the server, if you will. Working time deadline means that based on the calendar that is associated to this particular user, or user group I should say. So the user that has gotten this particular task assignment belongs to a group, and there is a calendar associated with that group. And that calendar determines the working days of the week. You don't want to set a deadline, let's say, for 1 hour from the time somebody receives this if they're working, I should say, let's say 1 day, but they receive it on a Friday. Well, we don't want to make the deadline occur on a Saturday because they're not working on a Saturday. Rather than use a fixed deadline, we want to use a working time deadline so that in 1 day it looks and it determines, no, it's Saturday. I'm going to wait until it's 1 day based on the working time or based on the calendar. So that's the difference between working time and fixed deadline. This one uses the calendar. This one uses just a fixed amount of time. And I'll show you where that calendar is in just a moment. The next thing it asks, of course, is, well, what is the deadline? So if it's a working time deadline, from what? From the time this got created, from the time the person opened it? Is it hourly, daily, weekly? So there's different ways that we can set that deadline. So let's set it from the work item creation, which is really pretty typical. And I want to set it for 48 hours from the time that the work item is created based on the calendar. The next thing that the deadline is asking me for is what kind of alert do I want to use? And here's where I told you can set up different kinds of alerts, and you can have multiple alerts set up for any given activity. If I wanted to do a priority escalation, so this was where I showed you the priority column in the work list, I can escalate the value to 1. And as I said, 100 is the lowest, 1 would be the highest. So we could set that to 50 or 1 or 3 or whatever it is we wanted to set it to. The rest of the alert asks us, when do we want to start the alert? If the deadline is in 48 hours, do we want to start that as soon as that 48 hours occurs, within 1 minute of that deadline occurring? And do we want to do that before or after that deadline occurs? So if I wanted to set up a deadline to happen 1 day before the actual deadline occurs, and that too would be very typical. You don't really want to wait until the deadline to alert somebody. You may want to alert them also at that time, but you might want to let them know that it's due soon. What we could do in that case then would be to say that we want to set it for 24 hours before that deadline occurs. So this is the starting time of the deadline. The next part of the equation is for, or basically how many times in what period of time do I want to send this notification out. I'm going to want to do this for 1 hour, let's say, in every 5 minutes. So every 5 minutes, which would be awful cruel, every 5 minutes for 1 hour, 24 hours before this deadline occurs, I'm going to send this alert. Now, because we're doing a priority escalation, it really doesn't matter, it's only going to occur one time. But if you were doing something like an email or notify, then of course this would recur. But because we're going to do a priority escalation, really makes sense for us to just do it 1 minute, one time. And then we can add the alert. So here's our first alert. Here's the alert start, here's how long it lasts, and here's the intervals in which it's going to occur. And now, of course, I could set up a second alert. So now if I wanted to set up an email alert, I can set up all the configurations for that and add it to the list, and I can set as many alerts up as I would like for this activity. And I'll come back and we'll talk about email alerts in a moment. And I did mention that I was going to show you the calendar for this working time deadline. Let's go ahead and take a look at that. In the operation environment of BPS, we have a number of configurations, and one of those is the calendar. So within BizFlow, you have a base calendar that's defined by default, which is what we're looking at here. For every time zone, you can see that we have a standard calendar, and it has a default working time. So we can modify that base calendar, but by default it's 8 o'clock in the morning to 12, and then 1 to 5 p.m. on a daily basis. That work could be distributed or people are working. There are non-working days, so it'll show which days are non-working days, for example Saturdays and Sundays, and then you can override or provide non-default working time on various days. So this is the base calendar. So by default, when you assign work and you use not a fixed deadline but a working time, it's going to use the default calendar of BizFlow. You can, on user groups, then change or customize that calendar. So for each user group in BizFlow, when you check out the particular group, and so here I have my user group, I'm going to check out that user group, you can see that there's a calendar option. Here's where I could create a new calendar, basically using that base calendar, that default calendar. I can customize it. Perhaps Saturdays are actually working days, so I'm going to change that to use the default working time. In this way, you can have either an organization that's global or national that may simply operate, different business units may operate differently and have different working time. That's what the calendar in correlation with user groups will allow you to do, and therefore your deadlines will be linked to these calendars.